Hey friends, I am hopping on today to share with you guys the story of Joseph. I'm sitting on my front porch, so I'm hoping it's not going to be too loud. We have a lot of cars by here. But Joseph actually grew up in a long time ago, and he had 11 brothers. He had a great big family. If you guys remember Jacob, he was a son of Jacob. And Joseph kind of ran into some trouble with his brothers because he was his dad's favorite child. And to show his favoritism, his dad actually made him a coat that had many different colors. And so not only did they have to deal with the fact that Joseph was the favorite, but they were reminded constantly when they saw Joseph in this really colorful coat. So you can imagine just the tension and just the ill feelings towards Joseph that they all dealt with. And instead of choosing to love him because he still was their brother, they actually treated him pretty poorly. But to make matters worse, Joseph also had some dreams. And you can read about this. If you want to open up your Bible, you can read about this in Genesis chapter. It starts in chapter 37 and it goes through chapter 42. But in Genesis 37, Joseph starts having some kind of crazy dreams, which I think all of us can relate to. I think most of us have had some kind of crazy dream at one point or another. But in Joseph's dreams, there were some different things that kind of represented his brothers and his family, and his dream were bowing down to him. So you can imagine this kind of made matters worse when he started sharing his dreams with his brothers, because not only was he his father's favorite, not only did they not like him anyway, but now that he was starting to have these dreams that said that they would one day bow down to him, it just kind of threw them over the edge. And so Joseph, his job in the family was as a shepherd. He took care of the family sheep. And so one day, his brothers also did this. And one day he was taking lunch out to his brothers, and they came up with this plan. And what they really wanted to do is they really wanted to kill Joseph. But one of the older brothers spoke up and said, let's not kill him. I just don't think that's going to be good. So while they were deciding what they were going to do, and when Joseph got closer, they actually took Joseph and they threw him into a pit or a hole in the ground. And Joseph just sat there for while his brothers were scheming and trying to decide what they were going to do. And so eventually their brothers decided that they wouldn't kill him, but they would use him to get some money. And so they actually sold their brother to some traders that were traveling through there. And so they sold their brother, and Joseph was actually taken to a faraway place called Egypt. And in Egypt, he sat in jail for a while because these traders, a lot of times, if they didn't know what they were going to do with the people they had picked up along the way, then they wouldn't send them to a hotel or somewhere nice to stay. They would stay in prison or in jail until they were bought by someone, and then they would go serve at their house. And so Joseph ended up in the house of a guy named Potiphar. And this is Genesis 39. And at Potiphar's house, he was a servant or a slave. And you can imagine these servants and slaves were typically not treated very well. They were forced to do work without being paid. So Joseph ends up in the house of Potiphar, and this is where he is set up to serve. And like I was saying, a lot of times these servants, these slaves, were not treated very well. They were treated pretty poorly. They weren't paid. And so this would have been an opportunity for Joseph to just kind of give up and to focus on his surroundings and his circumstances, and not focus on what God had asked him to do and who God had asked him to be. But Joseph chose to rise above that, and he continued to trust God even when his circumstances may have told him to do otherwise. And because he chose to trust God, and because he chose to do what God asked him to do and to be the man that God had asked him to be, God was with him. And because God was with him, he made Joseph very successful. And so even though Joseph was a slave in the house of Potiphar, he actually got put in charge of Potiphar's whole house. And let me see if I wrote it says in Genesis 39 and verse 6 that the only thing that Potiphar worried about was what he was going to eat. So he really trusted Joseph and allowed Joseph to be a large part of what was going on in his home. But unfortunately, someone else took notice of Joseph, and that was Potiphar's wife. And Potiphar's wife, even though she was married to Potiphar, continued to ask Joseph to do things that Joseph knew he shouldn't do. She wanted him to be a part of a relationship that he knew would not honor God and would not bring any honor or show any gratitude to Potiphar either. And so Joseph chose, even before he found himself in that situation, that he was going to do what God asked him to do. And even when Potiphar's wife put him in a situation where she tried to trick him, he just ran away from it. When he was put in or he was put in a situation where he had to choose whether or not he was going to sin, he literally ran away. And this ended up being a way that Potiphar's wife was able to lie about Joseph. And so Joseph was thrown into prison because of somebody else's lie. And unfortunately, y'all, that's going to probably happen. We may not be thrown into jail, but other people will choose to lie about us, and they will try to get us to do things that we know that God would not have us to do. And in those moments, we're going to have to make a decision, much like Joseph did, whether we're going to choose to do what God asked us to do, and we're going to choose to do the thing that would bring glory and honor to him, or whether we're going to do things our way, and whether we're going to do things our way, or do things the ways that other people tell us we should do them, which are not always right. So this is a good reminder of us to be aware of the situations we're putting ourselves in, and we can't always run away from sin like like Joseph did, but we have to be willing to rise above whatever circumstances we find ourselves in, so that we can do what God asked us to do and be who God asked us to be. And so from this point, because of Potiphar's wife's lie, Joseph is actually thrown into prison again. But God was still with him, and he could have chosen to focus on his circumstances. I'm here, I'm in prison again. I can't believe this is happening. What is God doing? Why am I here? But those are not the questions he asked. He continued to do what God wanted him to do and to be the man that God asked him to be. And so even in prison, God was with him, and Joseph was eventually put in charge of the prison as well. And one day there were actually two guys from the Pharaoh's house. You remember, Pharaoh is the king of Egypt, right? So there's two guys from Pharaoh's palace that end up in jail. One was the cupbearer, and the job of the cupbearer was to drink the drinks of the king to make sure they weren't poisoned. So the cupbearer was in prison with Joseph. And then also Pharaoh's baker, who would have been the one who baked food for Pharaoh. These two guys ended up in prison with Joseph, and both of them had some kind of crazy dreams. And Joseph knew that there's nothing he could do to tell anybody what they dreamed or what even their dream meant. But Joseph also knew that he had some crazy dreams, and God had told him exactly what his dreams were. And so he tried to help these guys, and he told them about the one true God, and told them about how powerful he was and how able he was to do all things. And so God gave him an understanding of what these guys' dreams were, and he was able to explain those to him, or to each of them. And one of them ended up dying, and he had dreamed that he would die. And so all of the things that Joseph had told them about their dreams came true, because we know that God does not lie. And because God was with Joseph and told Joseph what these dreams were and what they meant, Joseph was able to give them exactly that. And so you would think that when the fact that this guy in prison was able to tell them what their dreams were and what they meant, whenever they got out, they would immediately remember this guy and try to get him out. But unfortunately, they did not remember him. So they did not remember him, and he actually stayed in prison for 2 more years. And it was not until Pharaoh himself had a really crazy dream that the cupbearer remembered Joseph. And when Pharaoh had this crazy dream, he actually had a dream that there were some skinny cows and some fat cows, and the skinny cows ate the fat cows. So you can imagine how confused Pharaoh probably was. So he got all of his magicians, he got all of his wise men, these people that were supposed to know what this kind of stuff meant, He got all of them to come together, and he told them what his dream was, and nobody had any idea of what it meant. And so the cupbearer at this point remembers, oh yeah, I had a crazy dream when I was in prison, and this guy Joseph was able to help me and to tell me what my dream meant. And then not only that, what he said actually came true. And so they call for Joseph, who was still in the prison right where the cupbearer had left him, and had met him. They call Joseph, and Joseph comes and he shaves and he takes a bath, because obviously you can't go in front of Pharaoh being all stinky and stuff like you probably would have been if you were in prison at this time. So he comes before Pharaoh, and he is very careful. He does not want Pharaoh to think that he's able to do any of these things on his own, because he's not. So he is very careful to tell Pharaoh, I worship the one true God, and I can't tell you what your dream is, and I can't tell you what your dream means, but the one true God can. He's the one who gave you this dream. He's the one that even put a brain in your head for you to be able to dream. And that God is the one who is giving you this dream. And so he not only tells Pharaoh what his dream was, but exactly what it meant. And what his dream meant is that there were going to be several years of famine, which means that there would be a drought, which is when it doesn't rain. And obviously, if it doesn't rain, then your crops can't grow. And so if there is a famine, then it results in a food shortage, and people don't have enough stuff to eat. And so not only did Joseph tell Pharaoh that's what his dream meant, but God also gave Joseph a plan to help Pharaoh and his people to get through this famine. And so after Joseph told Pharaoh what his dream meant, he also gave Pharaoh a plan. And he said, if you know that this is coming, then the wise thing to do would be to start saving extra grain and extra food now, and building storage units for all these things now, so that whenever these years of famine do come, you'll still have all this stuff in storage, and you can break it out. And not only will you have enough food for your people, but also people from neighboring countries and places far away, they can come here and buy food from you. And the Pharaoh, the king, thought that this was an excellent plan. And so Joseph goes from being in the prison and having to be called from prison to being put in charge of Pharaoh's kingdom. He didn't become the king, but he was a very high official, a very high advisor of the king. He goes from being in prison to being one of the guys in charge of the whole nation of Egypt. And so from this point, people do start coming. Whenever this famine hits, people do start coming to Egypt to get food for their families and for themselves. And some of the very people that came to Egypt were Joseph's brothers, the ones that had tried to kill him, the ones that had tried to get rid of him, the ones who had lied about him. And they had even taken his coat, that fancy coat that his dad had given him. Whenever they sold him into slavery, they actually took his coat and they put some goat's blood on it to make it look like Joseph had been killed. But these brothers actually travel all the way to Egypt to get grain for their family during this famine. And guess what? Whenever they arrive, they bow down to Joseph, just like Joseph had dreamed. Joseph had these dreams about his brothers and his family bowing down to him when he was 17 years old, and now he was 30. So it took 13 years, but God's word was true. The very thing that he told Joseph would happen, even though it took a while, it did happen. And y'all, that's something we can learn from too. Sometimes it takes some time for what God says is going to happen to actually happen. But if he says it's going to happen, we know that it's going to happen, and we can cling to that. And so whenever Joseph's brothers showed up, you can imagine Joseph was probably feeling all sorts of emotions. He could have chosen to be very angry with them and to get revenge. But that's not what he chose to do. He was also probably a little bit sad to see his brothers. I mean, he hadn't seen them in so long. And his youngest brother, Benjamin, was the only other son of his mother, like his only other full brother. And Benjamin didn't come with them at first, but he found out that Benjamin was even alive at this point. So there's some excitement there, but he had all kind of different emotions that he was dealing with. But in all of the things that he was dealing with, he chose to do things God's way instead of focusing on his feelings. he didn't choose to focus on his anger. He didn't choose to focus on his desire for revenge if he had that desire. He didn't choose to focus on his sadness. He didn't choose to focus on any of those things. He chose to focus on what God wanted him to do in that moment. And what God wanted him to do was to show grace and to help his brothers, even though he was dealing with all these feelings. He chose to do what God wanted him to do, and he helped his brothers. Um, he didn't choose he didn't choose to do what he wanted to do, but what God wanted him to do, which is something that we're going to have to make the choice to do as well. And so Joseph saw God's faithfulness. He saw that God was a promise keeper, and that he does what he says he's going to do. And he was able, because he chose to trust God and to do things God's way and to still follow him even when he didn't understand. He was able to save many people's lives. If he had chosen at any point to do things his way, then God may not have revealed the meaning of Pharaoh's dream, and he may not have given Joseph a plan. But because Joseph chose to do things God's way at every point of his journey, God was able to do something way bigger than anything Joseph ever imagined. So I think there's a lot that we can learn from Joseph and from his life. I know each one of us faces hardships at different points. If you haven't found yourself in a situation wondering what God is or what he's doing yet, unfortunately, we all know that it's coming. And in those moments when we don't understand, and in the moments that things feel so hard and they feel so overwhelming, we can learn from Joseph. If we choose to trust God and to continue to do what he wants us to do, even in the midst of not understanding, he's going to reveal it in his time, and he's going to show us ways that he's been in control and the ways he's been working, and how all of it works together for not only his glory, but for our good and for the good of those around us. And if Joseph at any point had decided that he was not going to follow God, then his story would have been a lot different. And Joseph probably ran into opportunities where he was able to share different parts of his story and share how faithful God had been. And that's true in our lives too. In those moments where we don't understand what we're going through, God can use it for something much bigger, and he can use it to allow us to get to minister and love on people in ways that other people may not. Some of the hardships that he allows in your life may be hardships he allows in other people's lives, and you might have the opportunity to love on them and to understand them in a way that other people who have not faced those things wouldn't be able to. And so I challenge you guys today, look for opportunities, even in this season of uncertainty, and even in this season where we don't necessarily understand why things are the way they are. We can know that God is in control and he's still with us, and we can choose to trust him and to do what he wants us to do and not what we necessarily want to do, because those are not always the same. And if we choose to do things his way instead of our way, he can use our lives for something much, much bigger. So I challenge you guys this week to consider your perspective and to look for ways that God is still in control, and to give him thanks for everything that he has done in your life, and to give him thanks for the ways that he takes care of you. And I will see you guys next time.